Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here this morning, and my thanks go out to BC Care Providers Association for inviting me to be part of this very exciting conference. So I am speaking on the impact of COVID-19 on the demand for independent living and assisted living, plus a few other topics. It is really astonishing to think what our lives have been like over the past 15 months, given the impact of COVID. And that is what I'm going to be focusing on through the presentation, but also a couple of other things. And at the end, we will have 15 minutes for questions and answers. And I'm hoping that we get a good dialogue going then as well. Just to give you a bit of a background about who Luminous Services is, we've been doing consulting work in the seniors housing and healthcare field now for 20 years. We do market and feasibility studies in independent living, assisted living, long-term care. I'm going to be defining those terms in the next slide. We do development consulting, operational consulting, et cetera, et cetera. I have written 2 books on seniors housing. The first one, The Future of Seniors Housing, is on the curriculum of the housing management course at Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops. The second book's on life lease, which I'm going to touch on extremely briefly this morning. And the third book is the second draft is going to be finished on August the 31st, 2021. So I invite all of you to call me on September the 1st and ask me if the draft is finished. First of all, before we really get into it, I want to clarify the terms that I am using in this presentation. As we all know, the terminology in our industry is incredibly confusing, and I think it's actually getting more confusing rather than less confusing. These are the terms that we use in our business on a day-to-day basis, and the terms that I will be using during the presentation. First of all, independent living, IL. What I mean by that is housing plus what we often call hospitality services, meals, housekeeping, laundry, social and recreational activities, maybe transportation. That package of housing and services is called IL in almost everywhere in North America. Ontario is one outlier. They call it ISL, meaning independent supportive living, but everywhere else it is referred to as IL, and that is what I refer to it as. Assisted living, AL. It's important to remember that today I am talking about old AL meaning before Bill 16 AL. As far as I can tell, nobody really knows what post-Bill 16 AL will look like. So I'm talking about old AL, which is a combination of IL and some personal care, perhaps up to a maximum of about an hour and a half a day. Registered AL means situations where the personal care services are provided by the staff of the operator. Those units are registered with the Office of the Assisted Living Registrar, but it doesn't mean that they are necessarily being used to provide assisted living services. They're just registered. And the last definition is licensed AL. And it's important to bear in mind that there is no such thing as licensed AL. The term has been used more frequently lately, I think because people think it's a better marketing term, that it sounds better than long-term care, which maybe it does. But just remember, there is no such thing as licensed AL. In terms of numbers, there are just under 19,000 units in the province of private pay IL-AL. That is according to the latest CMHC Seniors Housing Report. The data for that were collected in February of 2020. And nobody knows for sure how many of those almost 19,000 units are AL, as I just mentioned. But that is the totality of the IL-AL private pay universe in British Columbia. I'm going to be talking during the presentation about the before times, meaning before COVID, the during times, and the after COVID times. So this slide, referring to the before COVID times, good stuff. I mean, you probably picked up on the fact that there's going to be some bad stuff too, which there will be coming up right away. But in the before COVID times, the occupancy rate in our private pay IL/AL universe was very high, 95%. Almost all of the units were occupied. That is according to the most recent CMHC seniors housing survey. The not so good stuff is important that we talk about this, that we think about this, that we address this. The numbers on the slide speak volumes, really. If you look at the number of people over the age of 75 in BC as of the last census, there are, as you can see, 410,711 of them. And of that number, only just under 19,000 are living in an IL/AL unit. The comparison between those two numbers is 4.6%. Those are our customers, basically. I want to briefly explain why we use 75 plus, because as you know, I mean, there's nobody 75 or 76 or 77 living in any of our communities, but they used to, years ago, people used to move into senior living at a younger age and even into care, into the old personal care homes. And that is back when the databases were developed by the industry in Canada and the United States. And that is why the population target starts at 75 plus. It doesn't make any real difference to the results of the analysis. If we increased it to 85 plus, the penetration rate, the ratio between those two numbers would go up, but the size of the population will go down. So it would make no real difference to the actual results of the analysis. So the comparison between those two numbers are what we call the penetration rate or the saturation rate or the capture rate. They're our customers, essentially. The penetration rate in British Columbia varies from about 3% to about 10%. The 10% or the 9-8, the higher penetration rates are typically in the Okanagan, where there are a lot of seniors housing projects. They've been around for a long time. People are used to them. And importantly, there is a very low proportion of visible minorities in the Okanagan, meaning people who live in cultures where it's customary for families to look after their elders until they are so frail that they need to move to assisted living. So they skip that intermediate stage of IL/AL, which is where where those cultures predominate in the population. That's where we find our lower saturation rates of 4%, 3%, that kind of thing. So not to beat a dead horse, and I'm sure you get the picture, we are not appealing to over 90% of our target market, and we never have. I am going to be talking about this. I'm going to be talking about this a bit more later in the presentation. So those were the before COVID times. Hard to believe, but during COVID times, things got worse. The headlines that we saw on social media, in the newspapers, on the radio, on television, the numbers just got worse from one day to the next, from 1 week to the next, from 1 month to the next. These headlines on this particular slide are from the US. The industry in the US takes the need for good and frequent data very seriously, and they devote significant resources to it. We don't do that in Canada, but they do in the US. And so that's where I wanted to point out the last bullet point. US seniors housing occupancy reaches new low. That's in the first quarter of 2021, 78.8%. And I am sure that the number in Canada is probably very similar, although we don't know for sure. but it probably is very similar. Things are improving for sure, but they have reached a very low ebb. In case those numbers don't sort of strike a bell with you, this chart probably will. The old picture, one picture tells 1,000 words. The bars on the right-hand side of the chart indicate the impact of COVID on occupancy. I mean, that's dramatic enough. But what I think is even more dramatic on this slide is to look at 08, 09, which is the last time we had a real serious event in the seniors housing and care industry, the recession of 08, 09, the Great Recession. The impact in the US was worse than it was in Canada because our housing market didn't suffer as much. But you just look at the difference between the COVID times and 08, 09, just to see what a very dramatic impact COVID has had on our industry. It is quite remarkable, amazing, astounding, in fact, all of those kinds of words. So why did occupancy why has it fallen so much? And you know, there are a number of reasons. Of course, welcome to our neighborhood, right? People with face masks and on and on and on. Hardly the most welcoming environment. And by the way, in addition, no eating together, no socializing together, no family visits, no going outside. There were millions and millions and millions of headlines, of course, just like this, all extremely dramatic. And they appeared every single day, week after week, month after month, now we're year after year. It is hardly any wonder that we have been going through this tremendous amount of trauma. So are we doomed? Living through the worst pandemic in 100 years has often felt like we are doomed. Why did this happen to us? Many of us have felt that way, I am sure. And for many of us, it has been a very tragic time. I don't believe that we are doomed over the long term from the perspective of our industry. I'm an optimist by nature, which is part of the reason for my belief. But in addition to that, I am also a market analyst focused on how to make things work. And I think there are ways to make things work going forward, and I'm going to be talking about them through the rest of the presentation. The number one reason why we aren't doomed, of course, is the vaccinations. And I just was reading this morning that over 50% of eligible British Columbians have had their first shot. And since we're recording this ahead of time, by the time the conference rolls around, it will be a much higher number. So that is the number one reason that we aren't doomed. And in case you didn't recognize the person getting the jab, it's Ryan Reynolds, in fact. Reasons 2 through 7. I'm not going to read all these. You can read them for yourself, but I'm going to talk a bit more about some of these points after the slide goes through. But I did want to point out that they have been doing a lot of research in the US on the impact of COVID on residents of ILAL communities. Now, the research has been done on residents, not on prospects. So that certainly gives you a different kind of flavor. But the vast majority of residents have indicated that they are happy that they were living in an ILAL community during COVID. They felt safe, they felt secure, they had the comfort of other people around them, and they were happy that they were there. Now, in terms of prospects, we don't know really what they're thinking, except that we know that they haven't been moving in. But in many cases, they couldn't. We weren't doing tours. If people moved in, they had to quarantine and that kind of thing. So we don't really know what people, whether TELUS is right about thinking that people have really changed their mind or not. One of the experts in the field is one of our locals, Dr. Stephen Taylor, who is the author of The Psychology of Pandemics. He's a professor at UBC. He's an expert in depression, anxiety, those kinds of areas. And some years ago, he got interested in pandemics. He wrote this book, The Psychology of Pandemics. He published it in a masterpiece of good timing in November of 2019. The hugely ironic thing about this book, aside from the masterpiece of good timing, is that he approached the publisher of his previous books to publish it, and the publisher said, "Oh no, we're not going to publish this one. We don't think anybody's going to be interested in the psychology of pandemics." That's just so hugely ironic, isn't it? I don't know if the person who made that decision is still with the publishing firm or not. But that being said, this is the view of Dr. Taylor about what's happening now and how things will proceed in the future. One of the reasons he says we're so anxious is because we have difficulty imagining the future. We have difficulty imagining a future that's different from the present, and that's one of the reasons that leads to heightened anxiety. But he points out that people are resilient, people will bounce back, life will return to normal. That is the view of an expert in the psychology of pandemics, which I think is hugely comforting. But of course, there will be another pandemic, and there's no point in not planning for it. And many people many operators, developers, builders, architects are thinking about what the next pandemic is going to be like, when it's going to come, and what we can do to plan for it. Things like HVAC systems, of course, are an obvious one, and people are spending a great deal of time and energy figuring out how to do that better. Organizations like Johns Hopkins University, a highly respected university in the United States, is offering this course, Strategies for Assisted Living Communities during, well, actually, it's during COVID-19, of course. I just put 2039 in there just for impact or something. But you can see that respected organizations like Johns Hopkins University are thinking about the next pandemic as well, and preparing courses and offering them. It's online, it's for free. So all of these strategies and techniques and mechanisms are going to help us deal with the next pandemic whenever it may rise, and it will make people feel more comfortable about moving into our communities. Here's a really interesting example of that. This is Astor Gardens in Sherwood Park near Edmonton. It's owned and operated by Optima Living Communities, which many of you will be familiar with. They're not clients of ours, I hasten to add. Astor Gardens is a brand new 157 unit ILAL community. And because the building was being built basically during COVID, they had the opportunity to think seriously about what they could do to counter the impact of COVID. And this is one of the ideas they came up with. This is called the Safe Entry Station, which are capable of detecting COVID-19 symptoms with a 98% accuracy in a matter of seconds, which is really quite astonishing, isn't it? The residents, the staff, the visitors, everybody is just thrilled with this. They don't think it's scary or alarming. It enhances their quality of life. They feel safer. I think it's very analogous to metal detectors and that kind of thing in airports. People go through them and they feel comforted by believing that they aren't going to be sitting next to a shoe bomber. I think it's a very good analogy. But, and you know, there's always a but. The but in our case is the baby boomers, and they are going to disrupt our industry more than COVID-19 did, mark my words. And I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the boomers and what they're likely to do, how they're likely to disrupt our industry, and what we need to do to deal with that disruption. So it's a good news, bad news stories, like many stories are. The good news is that the pie is growing, that the 75 plus population in BC will grow from about 400,000 currently to just under 1 million by 2043, which is only 23 years from now. But not to rain on anybody's parade, but remember that we are dealing with at the moment a penetration rate of 4.6%, which could even go down depending on the boomers. And so even given a population increase of 550,000 people, the 4.6 penetration rate means, in fact, that the unit numbers that will be required over the next 23 years equates to about 25,000, which is really very few when you think that it's the whole province and it's 23 years. So that really isn't very many. And also it's important to remember that although the 75 plus population is not composed entirely of boomers, there are a lot of boomers in that pie. And that is what we need to think about. How can we persuade the boomers to embrace seniors housing more than their parents did? And what does it have to look like? So first, let's think a bit about who the boomers are. They're currently aged between 57 and 75. The years of birth are 46 to 64. In BC, 78% of them are homeowners, and the incomes of those homeowners are an average of $103,412. That's before they sell their house. And of course, homeowners in many areas of British Columbia own an extremely valuable asset, even more valuable now than it was pre-COVID, which is maybe the only good thing that came out of COVID. So more importantly, what are they like, and will they choose traditional seniors housing? And the answer to that question is probably not. Why not? They are a completely different generation than their parents were. Their parents are often called the silent generation. They grew up and lived through many traumatic events, including the Great Depression, the World War I, World War II. They, as a result of those events, they have different mindsets than the boomers do. I've got shoe bombers on my mind. They are frugal. They respect authority. Women had a different role in society. The boomer generation has been completely different. They've had their traumatic events as well. For example, the Vietnam War. But as a generation, they've had very different experiences than their parents, and they have, in many respects, have changed the world in good ways and bad ways, I suppose. I mean, we did go through that whole okay boomer thing, which as a meme, which doesn't seem to be around anymore. But in light of the completely different characteristics of the boomers compared to their parents, are they going to be attracted to 3 meals a day in the dining room? And I don't think they will. So what will they be attracted to? That's the question. Might it be active adult? Is that the next big thing? What I mean by active adult is all of these bullet points on the slide. The important points to note about the nature of active adult is units are bigger, much bigger than the typical ILAL unit. They have full kitchens, in-suite laundry. There aren't any commercial kitchens or communal dining rooms. Services, if there are any, are a la carte. And it is definitely a lifestyle option, much more than a needs-driven option, which is what we have been working with over the last 30 years in our industry. They can be either rental or purchase. And of course, one of the other appealing factors of active adult is they require much fewer staff. And as we all know, the staffing levels in our industry are going to be a major concern going forward. The active adult has been emerging in a major way in the US for the last 10 years, and much less so in Canada, but there are a few examples, and I'm going to show you them in a couple of examples in a minute. One of the tricky things about active adult is what happens when people get so frail that they need services, and which will inevitably happen. I mean, people move in, they're 70 or 75, they're golfing every day, they're very active, but 20 years later, they may need some supportive services. And what happens then? And that is an issue that the active adult sector has not really come to terms with. It is a tricky question, and they are thinking about it. There are different approaches. One of them, for example, in Minnesota, where there is a major provider of active adult housing, what they tell their prospects is, we don't provide services here because this is the kind of community that we are providing and offering and that our residents want to live in. But if somebody does require more help, we know exactly how to deal with that. And their prospects find that very reassuring. Another way of dealing with that is through a campus, through a situation where in one community there are all levels of housing and care. So if people need to relocate to for more care or more services, they don't need to relocate off the campus. And I'm going to talk about that very shortly. This is Three Robins in Stony Plain, which is an active adult rental community in Stony Plain, right near Edmonton. And it is 85 units. Three Robins is a brand. There is a Three Robins in Stony Plain. There's a Three Robins in Red Deer. And the company is developing, looking at sites for Three Robins elsewhere in Canada. They have the full kitchens, larger units, in-suite laundry. The Stony Plain Library is located on the main floor of this building. All the services are a la carte. In Red Deer, the Three Robins has a bistro open to the public on the main floor. It's open for breakfast and lunch. So residents living in the building can either go to the bistro for breakfast and lunch and eat half their lunch and eat the other half at dinner, or they can do all their cooking on their own if they want to. So they have the choice. And if they want meals delivered to their unit, they get the meals delivered from the bistro during its open hours. One of the interesting features about Three Robins is they have developed and implemented major volunteer programs. And in fact, people who volunteer for a minimum number of hours a month, I forget what it is, they get a reduction in their rent. It's not a huge amount, but it is an amount, about $200 a month. Their rents are reduced. But what they have found is that the volunteer hours are much, much higher than the requirement for rent reduction. That people volunteer because they want to, they like it, they enjoy it. It gives them a purpose in life. And so the volunteer program in the Three Robins projects has turned out to be very successful. This is Sunstone Apartments in Delta. It is a age-restricted rental project in the Delsum Estates Master Plan community in North Delta. The reason it's there is because the municipality of Delta insisted that it be part of the Master Plan community. It's age restricted, as I said, it's rental, and there are quite a lot of amenity areas in the building, but there aren't any services there. At least there aren't any services there at the moment. They could, as time goes on, of course, introduce services to the building, but they haven't now. In terms of food service, the Delsum Estates is developing a commercial strip mall right now. It must be close to completion by now, which is actually right across the street from Sunstone Apartments. And the Delsum Estates, the developer, bought a franchise restaurant, which will be part of the commercial development. And so people living in the Sunstone Apartments who don't want to cook can either go to the restaurant or can arrange for delivery or whatever as time goes on. And if more people in Sunstone Apartments wanted food service, then obviously it could come over from the restaurant. So that's how Delsum Estates has dealt with that. Best of all possible worlds. What I mean here is in terms of people being able to stay in one community for the entirety of their lives, for people who are living independently and don't need any services, all the way up to long-term care. And one of the ways of dealing with that, of course, is through a campus, as I mentioned earlier. This particular campus is called the Village at St. Elizabeth Mills in Hamilton. It is a very large community, over 100 acres. There are over 500 life lease units for completely independent seniors on the campus. Life lease is a type of tenure for the provision of seniors housing. I call myself, I'm the self-appointed #1 advocate of life lease housing in Canada, but I promise I'm not going to talk about life lease this morning. In addition to the life lease units, St. Elizabeth, when it's finished, will also include assisted living, long-term care, commercial operations, of course, restaurants, stores, that kind of thing. So the question of what happens when somebody gets too frail to stay in their life lease unit, or what happens when one spouse of a couple living in a life lease unit gets too frail, then there are options for them right in the neighborhood where they have lived for years, that they're familiar with, that they know and they love. So that is the advantage of a campus in those circumstances. This particular project is being created by Zest Communities. Riz Galen is the CFO of Zest, and I'm sure everybody on this call knows Riz very well. What about home care? And this quote from Zoomer magazine, a recent edition of Zoomer magazine, is sort of shines some light on the issue of home care, which I think is going to become more and more important. And it has been, of course, discussed often by health authorities over the last few years, health authorities thinking that if they provided more home care, that they would be able to reduce the demand for long-term care to some extent at least. Note that in the latest provincial budget, the provincial government is putting its money where its mouth is. It has allocated $68 million over 3 years to increase the number of care aides and other community care providers to deliver quality home care. In addition to that, $12 million to provide home care to seniors with complex care needs in their homes. So that's $80 million over 3 years in an attempt to increase the impact and the use of home care. And I do think that this is inevitable. Some variations on the home care theme I want to talk about for a minute. PACE type programs. PACE stands for Programs of All-Inclusive Care for the Elderly. There are many of them in the US, almost none in Canada, at least at the moment. How they work is that clients of the PACE programs must be certified as eligible for nursing home care, but they also must be able to live in their own homes. So what happens is that they go to the PACE program during the day and are provided with all the services and care that would be provided if they were living in a conventional nursing home, but then at the end of the day, they go home. The virtual retirement communities, CCRCs without walls, those are kind of a variation on the theme. CCRCs are the American version of campuses, continuing care retirement communities. They're all campuses, and there are thousands of them in the United States, many more campuses there than there are here. CCRCs without walls and virtual retirement communities means that existing operators will go out and provide services to people in the surrounding neighborhoods. What that means for the operators is as a source of revenue, but it is also creates a pipeline. Because if they're going out in the community and providing services to people in the neighborhood, if those people or some of those people at some point need to move, I mean, where are they going to move to? They are going to move to the community where they're familiar with the operator. We've been interested in this whole aspect of care for a number of years, and in fact are working right now with one of our clients, taking a very, very detailed look at how exactly it can work and what the business plan aspects are like. So I do think that the virtual retirement communities are going to emerge more strongly in the future. Of course, for the existing operators, for the existing ILAL communities all across British Columbia, all across Canada, I mean, many of which are, I mean, some of them are older, but many are new, like Astor Gardens, just opened, many new communities. And what's going to happen to them if the boomers behave completely differently from their parents? Well, that remains to be seen. But of course, the strong suit of any existing community, as this particular slide points out, is its rich relational experiential life with other people. And that is the important aspect of our existing ILAL communities that must be emphasized, and in fact is being emphasized. I mean, there are many operators who are publishing very thoughtful ads in print media, social media, television, radio, about this very topic, that you don't want to stay in your existing unsafe home. Come and live with us where you'll be safe, you'll be secure, there will be people around you and things to do. So that is definitely a saving message for sure. So what people want, they want safe and secure housing, but they also want purpose, meaning, engagement, health and wellness, supports as they age, if and when they need them, fun and enjoyment, and of course, affordability if it can be managed. Simple, huh? Well, of course, it's not simple, but it is a challenge, and we all like a challenge. I think, in fact, that where we are now in 2021, given all the changes that have occurred in the last 15 months, given the changes that are going to occur as the boomers get closer to the stage when they're going to be actively looking for a different way of life, I think it is really the most exciting time to be in our industry ever. And I am really looking forward to the future, and I hope all of you are as well, because it is going to be challenging, interesting, exciting, and fun. The last word, ageism. One of my life's goals is to do whatever I can to counter the impact of ageism. And I believe that we should all do whatever we can to do that, because I think ageism is a big reason why we have penetration rates down at 4.6%. People thinking or saying things like, I don't want to live with all those old people, when if they thought about it a little more carefully, they would realize how interesting and inspirational and encouraging old people can be. So that is one of my goals, and I hope it is one of your goals, to do whatever we can collectively to counter ageism. A report from the World Health Organization that just hit my desk this morning, a global report on ageism. So by all means, Google that. And what the World Health Organization pointed out is that ageism affects how we think, feel, and act towards others and ourselves based on age. It imposes powerful barriers to the development of good policies and programs for older and younger people, and has profound negative consequences on older adults' health and well-being. Part of that could very well be that they would be much better off moving into a congregate living environment, but they don't, for whatever reason. Maybe perhaps one of them including they don't want to live with all those old people. So in our industry, I think it's incumbent on all of us to do whatever we can to counter the negative effects of ageism in our society. All right, that's it, folks. Thank you very much for your attention. I've enjoyed very much putting this presentation together. It gave me a lot to think about. I hope it's given you a lot to think about. If you have any questions or answers, we can do that now. And if you have violent disagreements with anything I've said, I'd love to hear about that as well. So thanks to you for listening, and thanks again to the BC Care Providers Association for inviting me here today.